Hello and welcome to Tech, Power and Media. In this episode, I'm focusing on power and media, namely the future of the BBC and what that looks like. This is amid a Conservative government and amid job cuts at the BBC. The corporation has dominated the media in the UK and culture, arguably, for years on end. But that future looks slightly shaky. I'm joined by Will Turvill of the Press Gazette and New Statesman Group. I hope you enjoy the video. So, Will, thanks very much for joining me. A big topic on my mind, and you've written a lot about it, so partly because of you, is the future of the BBC. And my main question is, what does the future of the BBC look like as it stands now?
In a few words, uncertain and slightly bleak, I'd say. But then I'm sure you probably could have said the same thing at lots of time in the BBC's 100-year history.
Yeah, and I've noticed as well, morale, well, you've written on the fact that morale seems to be low, apparently. There's a lot of shake-up when it comes to presenters, and we've seen the best example I can give most people who aren't as geeky as us when it comes to media is probably like the news agents with Lewis Goodall, Emily Maitlis, and John Sopel, all from the BBC, but they've all gone to global. And before that, Andrew Marr. So are you seeing a lot of that, hearing a lot of that? If the morale is low, what are people going to do next?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, as I recently reported in my New Statesman article, morale is very low there currently. And again, it's one of those things where there have been reports. I asked Justin Webb, the Today programme presenter, about this last year when I started to hear. In fact, I'd read in the Sunday Times had run a headline that was Fear and Loathing in the BBC. And I asked him about that, and he said, you could write that headline about the BBC at any year. And indeed, people have written that same headline every year since I've been at the BBC. So there is a sense that morale is always a big issue at the BBC. But I definitely get the feeling from conversations that I've had with, at least more than a dozen staff for the New Statesman article. And also actually a lot of people got in touch with me afterwards to say, yeah, you completely hit the nail on the head there. And this was, a mixture of people who were either at the BBC or people who had left the BBC. And yeah, the message is, morale's really low at the moment. It's years of cutbacks. It's high profile departures, as you mentioned, Emily Maitlis, John Sopel, Andrew Marr, Andrew Neil going back a couple of years. All of those departures together, along with high profile departures that I think your readers, viewers, listeners, and Press Gazette and the New Statesman's audience would recognise, but the general public wouldn't necessarily know the name Dino Sopos, who's the guy who runs the Newsagents podcast through his company Persephonica. Kamal Ahmed, I mean, he was on Screen Talent, but he'd kind of moved on to, I think he was editorial director of the BBC. He left. That was a big deal. So it's a really tough time. Lots of high profile people have left, and lots of important and good journalists behind the scenes as well. So yeah, morale is definitely low. And how do they get out of it? I don't know. I think, what do you,
Yeah, I mean, not just, I think Justin's comment, I respect him very much as a journalist. I think he's fabulous, but I would say I think that's a bit of a cop-out, quite frankly, in the sense of, now,
I did Google it though. I Googled it, and and I found a New Statesman article from maybe 20 years ago that was headlined Fear and Loathing in the BBC. And that was around the time of the Hutton report. So, BBC's
that's understandable,
never far away from a scandal. But yeah, I think your instinct is right, and that it is a really, really tough time for the BBC.
I mean, for people who are unaware, particularly more of an American audience, North American audience, I mean, so you've got a Tory government which could be out of could be out of power next year, where we're expecting a general election. But you've got that pressure. The DG was a Tory activist. The chairman has had his own issues. This is Richard Sharp with regards to Boris Johnson and his involvement in a loan there. and then he's fought on. So there seems to be a good amount of political pressure. And as a Conservative member myself, I mean, one of the questions that I think should be raised with the cabinet at large, because this relates to a lot of things, is what do you want the BBC really to do? And one of the things that struck a chord, was the world affairs element and foreign affairs, because that's always been a great part of our soft power, right? But it seems that we're cutting back on that. And I read a really interesting report, which I'm sure you picked up as well, Will, which was in the Digital Media Select Committee, about all the things that they wanted the BBC to do. And I'm thinking, well, it's a bit of a rock and a hard place, isn't it?
With regards to?
With regards to the cuts, with regards to the political pressure, and at the same time, Tory politicians, because that's led by Damien Green, Select Committee, want the BBC to do more, and at the time, they're having to do less. So I really feel for them.
Yeah, that is really difficult, isn't it? They always have to strike a balance between being seen to be, I suppose, either cutting back or running on a good value for money, while also just producing the very best journalism. I think, as well as with the example that you mentioned, the stuff around local news is interesting, because they're cutting back local radio, and that's kind of good because they're saving money, which they need to do. But then also you have lots of people who'd say, "Oh, that's terrible because we really need local radio," and you're cutting out people who don't have access to good internet, who aren't part of metropolitan bubbles, which is. So I think that's another good example to show exactly what you're talking about there, the rock and the hard place. The rock being, I suppose, them needing to save money, and the hard place being they also at the same time need to be very, very good, like the very best journalism operation they can be. And then as part of that as well, and again relating to the local news cuts, obviously, so they're cutting from local radio because they think that a lot of their audience is moving online, which is perfectly fair. But then you have Press Gazette's readers, or people who run local media companies saying you can't invest more money in challenging us online in local news. So yeah, it's a really difficult balancing act, and it seems to be again a really tough place for them at the moment.
I was actually going to go into that because I've spoken to Nick Hilton of Podot, who worked at The Spectator, New Statesman, and many other places. And we discussed this quite a lot. And he's made the point about podcasting. BBC now dominate the podcasting market. And obviously you can argue from the BBC's perspective, it's a natural evolution and innovation. But the small podcast production companies say, well, you've just come in and bazookaed us, to your point about local news.
Yeah, podcasts are interesting. I know that I've heard that Deborah Turness, the new chief executive of BBC News, is really interested in podcasts. Yeah. Well, I would slightly. I'll sorry. I'll let you get to your question afterwards. Although I would slightly challenge the position that BBC dominates podcasts, because I think it should, and I know that in the public podcast charts, they don't take into consideration sounds listenership, which means that it is, BBC will have very big podcasts. But I do think it's interesting actually that there are challenger podcasts, or don't know if you call them challengers, but the news agents, the rest is politics. They seem to be, from what I've heard and what you see in the podcast charts, they seem to be, and I realize that's only a few, but they seem to be bigger than, say, newscast, which is interesting, because you might expect the BBC, having had its dominance in radio, to dominate podcasts. And I think you're right that they are investing a lot in podcasts. So you're right to make that point. But I'd say currently it looks like they're slightly underperforming in terms of the size of the business they have. But investment should be a good way for them to remedy that, I suppose.
Yeah, I was thinking.
Sorry to interrupt. It's just an interesting. That's an interesting area that I've spent some time thinking about and talking to people about.
Yeah, the one area that they don't seem to be in is newsletters, at least in the UK. It seems that they're looking to do that in America, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? I wonder why that is.
I know on the website they have a sort of section which is sort of analysis, namely by an editor or a very senior correspondent. So I suppose it's to stick with that. But it'd be interesting down the line if they do go for the newsletters, which is a hyper-competitive space, something that Politico Spectator have done very well in the current affairs realm, amongst others. But I mean, from your side of the fence, and continue to report on the BBC, and we've talked about morale. What are others outside of the corporation saying about it? What are the likes of the peers and competitors in broadcast or the like saying about the BBC? Do they tell you much?
I think in general, there's a feeling there's a really big opportunity for broadcasters, rival broadcasters. And I'd say particularly taking the example of the merger of BBC News Channel and the World News Channel, I think there's a feeling among UK news channels that that's a big opportunity for them because of the merger. And some within the BBC, I know, are unhappy about the fact that it kind of feels like a weighted merger towards the world news. So I think, and inevitably because of that merger, BBC can't devote 24/7 coverage to domestic news anymore in the UK. So I think they see that as a big opportunity to move in. So, I mean, and you look at it and you think, well, yeah, it is a big opportunity for Sky News because it's kind of a similar offering, isn't it? So if the BBC's going to be, I don't know what the split will be, but say it was half UK coverage, half world coverage, then that's 12 hours a day where Sky News can say to its viewers or potential viewers, just come and watch us, and you get 24-hour, it's not fully UK news, but, you know, mostly UK news, or news that's certainly completely relevant to a UK audience. And again, yeah, I think I reported a couple of weeks ago for Press Gazette that GBNews has set itself the target of becoming the UK's largest news 24-hour news channel I think, by 2028, which sounds really ambitious, especially when you consider the early reports on its figures when it started. But actually, it has been making a bit of a comeback, and I've seen some figures which kind of show that it's, you know, still much smaller than the BBC News Channel, but it's made up ground broadly, and occasionally in prime time, and obviously when on particularly special occasions, I suppose, they actually have occasionally get more viewers than the BBC News Channel, which is impressive when you consider where it's come from. So I think in broadcast BBC news channels, I think their rivals definitely see a big opportunity there. I would have thought the same thing is true of others in other sectors as well. Radio again is quite interesting. If you look at the latest radios, I don't have them off the top of my head, but the fastest growing radio stations, admittedly, they are much smaller still, but the fastest growing are Talk Radio and Times Radio, and Global's big. I think, you know, the total listenership of BBC Radio is now smaller than it was than the commercial radio sector. I believe that threshold may have been passed a little while ago, but yeah, it's notable. And I think again, they'll probably be thinking there's a big opportunity. Again, in podcasts, I think people will be thinking there's a big opportunity here because, it's the rock and the hard place thing again, I suppose, isn't it? Because BBC's got to be seen to be, or actually has to cut back because its budgets are shrinking. And yeah, so big opportunities, I think. I'm not sure about local, and we did also touch on local news. I'm not sure about that so much. I think maybe local news companies are as we spoke about earlier, slightly concerned about the BBC's big ambitions there.
Yeah, you've done a very skillful job, Will, of wrapping up all the trends that are going on as well. I was going to quickly, just on the trend point, I saw reported in the Press Gazette that was it Daily Mail has gone below, was it
800,000?
800,000, yeah. I just want to focus on that a second. I mean, that seems like a significant element. We know that print is in decline. I feel that it could have a bottom on it. I don't know what you think about it. Because Daily Mail fairly recently has become the most popular paper again. Do you think what's the rhyme and reason behind this slump?
The newspaper sales.
Yeah. Well, in particular with the Mail, and then others.
I think it is difficult to to pinpoint anything specific. It's kind of been the trend for a long time, hasn't it? And yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the you know, I can't remember what term you used, but the bottom, where does
There is a
I,
bottom. Yeah.
I suppose what you're getting at is when are we going to see the next big national newspaper closure? It's not going to be the Daily Mail, but I do feel like we must be getting close, because if now I didn't realize we'd get into this, but if I did, I would have thought about looking up to remind myself what the circulation of the Independent was when it closed its print edition. And yeah, it can't be too far off what some of the national newspapers are on
think
currently.
it was, if my memory serves me right, I think it was below 100,000. I think it was around
Yeah,
80.
close to 50,000 maybe.
So yeah, it could even be as low as that.
But yeah, some of the newspaper circulations are getting close to that level. And while they've all increased their cover prices quite a bit, and obviously it's not all about cover price, but obviously the Independent decided it wasn't sustainable. And I guess, yeah, you would think there will be newspaper closures coming at some point for some of the newspapers at the bottom. But then again, people like me have been saying that for 10 years. So who knows? I guess the thing is that some of the newspapers that have lost a lot of their circulation are owned by Reach. And I think there's a fair amount of resource sharing there. So it's not exactly like the Independent, where the Independent had a large team of journalists who all had to be funded mainly by newspaper sales and newspaper advertising. But yeah, so I don't know, and I don't know. I think with the latest Daily Mail figures, I looked at the table, and I didn't note off the top of my head, although maybe you'd correct me on this, whether their slump is particularly pronounced compared with others. And it's difficult as well because there are a lot of newspapers that don't have their numbers audited anymore, because I think the reasoning behind that is, and it's same happened in the US, of course, newspapers don't really like to talk about print circulation figures anymore because I think it distracts from the actual positive stories they've got to tell. So yeah, Mail's interesting. I think Mail Plus is could be big at some point. They seem to be investing a lot of time and resources into it.
And that seems to be a bit of a revival. They seem to have a first stab at it. It sort of fell on its face effectively, and now they're going again, but they're being a lot more disciplined about it seems.
Seems so, doesn't it? Yeah, I guess. Yeah, and there seems to be a fair amount of enthusiasm for it, which is good, and it looks like a good offering, I think. And I guess maybe they're looking at all publishers must be, I would have thought, looking at News UK, News Corp's arm, and thinking, well, that looks like a good place to be working in many ways, because the Times Radio, I mean, who would launch a radio station in 2020? But it seems to be working quite well. I mean, I don't know what you think, and I don't exactly know the commercial figures behind it, but in terms of its impact, I think it's doing a pretty good job. And I would have thought that journalists at the Times quite like having that option. They've got TalkTV's moving fully into the news building in a couple of months, and so at that point you're going to have lots of print journalists who are potentially worried about their jobs being slightly outmoded, and now all of a sudden they're all turning into radio presenters, or at least radio correspondents, and also TV correspondents. So yeah, that's interesting, and I think you can see a lot of what the Mail's trying to do with Mail Plus is it's not just about the written stuff anymore, is it? It's the videos, podcasts, and everything. So yeah, it's an interesting time.
I think it's definitely a rationalization. There's an element, I feel, that it's catching up to American model, where you will see, you know this, Will, but you will see a correspondent, say like Maggie Haberman, will be also signed to a broadcaster as an analyst. So these guys are now keeping them in-house. And also the other rationalization, of course, we know at the Times, the Sunday Times, there's an element of those newsrooms come together. The same is happening at the Mail on Sunday. And also, I think what's most interesting to it, and really just adding on what you said, Will, is I suppose it's the scalability. So if you get a good story in Times Radio, that will be in the Times print edition and so on and so forth. But also the amplification, right? That, you know, if you've got a good print story or whatever, it's now amplified by this bigger beast And I've seen it. I've been very impressed actually with TalkTV doing elements of that. And I think they've actually used Piers Morgan very well by way of
Agreed. Yeah.
example. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually, a senior BBC journalist, I was talking to him with him recently, and he said to me, "You should ask number 10 Downing Street," as if I have a direct line into them at all times. He said, "You should ask them why Rishi Sunak decided to give his interview to Piers Morgan to a channel with no viewers." And I asked an interviewee about that, who was a former number 10 director of comms, and he said, "Well, I think you could it's Piers Morgan's Twitter feed to begin with." And then I kind of would add to that also, yeah, it's then guaranteed big coverage in the Sun, the Times. If there's anything international, then it can go into the New York Post. And it's Times Radio. I mean, yeah, it's a big operation, isn't it?
Yeah.
And appealing.
He didn't give an interview to Piers Morgan of Talk TV. He gave an interview to Piers Morgan and News Corp.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, absolutely.
That's the difference. And just bring it back. I mean, I was going to focus on the BBC, but I think this relates to all the brands that we're talking about. We're now effectively in two election cycles, one in the UK and one in the US, leading up to 2024. What are you seeing on the horizon in relation to that? And also, do you think, you sort of painted the picture of some of the competitor brands? Can you see them continually to steal the sort of BBC's thunder and make great strides as we head closer to those dates?
Yeah, that is an interesting question, isn't it? Because while the BBC maybe and some of its brands has gone slightly out of fashion as we've got these new competitors rising, are people going to, when it comes to an election, are we going to see people turning back towards the trusted brands of the BBC to hold people to account and to cover the election in a balanced and impartial way? I think there could be something in that, and I'd guess that 2024 is going to be a good year for news companies in general, just because, yeah, as you say, two big elections for anyone who's in our sphere, basically. So yeah, that'll be really interesting. I would have thought again that the commercial players will see it as a big opportunity. And one other, an interesting area, someone mentioned to me recently that they described the 2024 UK election as, or they predicted it would be the TikTok election, which will be interesting to see exactly how that plays out. I would have thought that, that's going to be Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer doing lots of interviews on TikTok or on formats that are going to be TikTok friendly, which will be interesting. And again, it kind of looks like the BBC, to be fair to it, under Deborah Turness, who very highly rated in the news industry in general. We don't know too much about her vision at BBC News yet, but I know that one thing she is interested in is TikTok and the BBC over the last couple of years. I think a lot of people, you've probably heard this as well, and you might make the same comment, but I think people generally think the BBC was a little bit slow to TikTok, and now it seems to be investing big in it, and that probably looks like quite a good calculated bet ahead of the election year. So that'd be interesting.
Not to put this on you, Will, but I wrote on TikTok, and listen, I've said media companies have made criticisms of TikTok, right? But at the same time, they have embraced it. The last one to do so very recently was actually the New York Times. New York Times had a cooking TikTok. It didn't do the main thing, and as you mentioned, BBC had a very big one. So I suppose the question is, how do they weigh that up? They're publishing a lot of criticisms about these particular tools, but at the same time, they're using it because they can see they can get a big audience on it.
Yeah, that is difficult. I'm not sure you should put it on me. I don't have a TikTok account.
I don't either.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess maybe. Yeah, no, that came up a few times in my conversations with BBC people actually behind the scenes, which is half people are very pleased that the BBC's finally getting into TikTok belatedly, and the other half are saying, well, is that a wise thing to be doing? I think the answer probably is that you have to go with it. You can't ignore it currently. And yeah, whether that turns out to be a wise investment or not ultimately is going to be difficult. But then at least everyone's doing it, or is everyone doing it? I don't know. Has anyone? You aware of many media brands that have?
I think all the major ones are now in TikTok.
Yeah.
Something that I keep a close eye on are the platforms. I know TikTok is now trying to explore longer videos, interestingly. So it's going to try and go towards YouTube, whereas YouTube has done a lot of stuff on YouTube Shorts, trying to copy TikTok. So I suppose we'll see where we are in a couple of years on that. I think that would be a good, particularly post-election.
Yeah.
But that stick with this theme of sort of looking ahead. I mean, we've sort of talked about social media a little bit, the elections. Is there anything on your radar, and in particular to do with media, for 2023 or further?
On my radar, I did actually want to make one more point about TikTok, just briefly, and that is that I suppose when we talk about investing in TikTok, what you're really doing is investing in the technology to make good TikToks. And you think maybe that even if TikTok becomes the sort of platform that media don't want to be associated with, you'd think that there would be another platform that would rise up and be of a similar format. So there is that. But the 2023, what am I looking out for? Was it 2023 or 2024? Did you ask?
The future, Will. The future.
I have to say, it's kind of this is a grim note, but it is kind of difficult to look directly beyond the ad market slowdown we're in at the moment. Lots of rumours about job cuts across the media, Fleet Street in particular. The News Corp trying to cut 5% of its costs overall. I think there've been rumours about cuts coming at the Mail, although unsubstantiated currently. It's a little bit difficult to look beyond that. But yeah, I mean, actually, you've raised a really interesting one, which is when is the BBC going to go big on newsletters, and why hasn't it already? Which seems crazy, but maybe it's because the newsletters that do particularly well are those that might not fit exactly under the BBC brand.
Well, that lends to another question that I was going to ask with regards to revenue models, and obviously Substack, the rise of Substack, the rise of newsletters. Tell you what, these companies fantastic because you get a nice recurring revenue, visible, and investors love it. That's why the New York Times has traditionally done well in the past 5 years, thanks to Mr. Mark Thomas, who's obviously no longer there. But I imagine, and if you look at the stats, most people subscribe to one or two news outlets. So my question to you, Will, is, how feasible do you think brands adopting more and more subscription style revenue business models are feasible, or is an element of there that will just turn off readers who frankly don't want to go through 20 emails in their inbox in the morning?
Yeah, that is a difficult question. Do you mean paywall subscriptions or specifically newsletter subscriptions or specifically paid newsletters?
I would say paid.
Paid newsletters. How many? Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? It's a difficult question.
Well, let me say, I'll throw some facts while you're pondering, which is I know through the Reuters Institute of Journalism at the University of Oxford, that is the typical figure. It's only one or two, and that's very popular.
Is that UK or global?
That's global. In Scandinavia, they have a bigger culture, and in particular when it relates to regional and local journalism, they're willing to pay. And also, listen, we're in a sort of inflationary climate. There's a cost of living crisis. People are looking at their subscriptions, and for the most part, looking to cut across the board. So it's always come up in my mind, and I just share my own thoughts. I think it's really important that these media brands, particularly the insurgent ones, create a good, solid base of multiple revenue streams. I'll tell you who I think's done really well in this. It's probably Punchbowl out of the US. Great foundation stone where it is subscription based, but they've just absolutely nailed that insider about way Washington beats, sort of following the footsteps, of course, of Politico. But the other revenue streams sponsorships of the newsletters, sponsorships of their events, and thought leadership and many other things. So I would say to anyone who would listen to me in the industry, listen, build a strong base, but make sure you've got multiple streams coming in. And also, final one on that, I think they do a little bit of merch as well.
Yeah. I interviewed their chief executive a couple of at the end of last year. I think they have been good. It's maybe difficult, isn't it, to if you're running a media business, to look beyond exactly what's trendy now, and like you say, to build out in lots of different ways at the same time. And doing that as a startup is quite difficult as well, because you need someone doing all of those things. But I agree that Punchbowl is looking good.
I mean, it's hard for the UK and Europeans because that's just a bigger play area, so to speak, isn't it, in the US?
Yeah, I actually, to go full circle, I think one of the things that makes it really difficult for a news company in the UK trying to persuade people to pay is the BBC, because it's its online news is excellent, and you can trust it, and it covers a lot of things. So it is difficult, which I guess is, well, it's a different conversation, isn't it? But I mean, some people would say that's why newspapers in the UK have their coverage tends to be more partial than the BBC's, and they lean one way or the other to make sure they capture their audience.
That's right. And then just for the sort of final section, bringing it back to yourself, bringing it back to the Press Gazette. I was really interested a couple of years back now, isn't it, that, the takeover of the New Statesman, since become the New Statesman Group. Wondered if you could just briefly outline how that works from a sort of reporter side, because I've seen you reporting both in the Press Gazette, of course, and the New Statesman.
Yeah, so my role, it's quite unique in the company. So yeah, Press Gazette and the New Statesman are sister publications that have been for several years. And yeah, the company that Press Gazette's part of rebranded as New Statesman Media Group it was around 2020, and that's around the time when I joined the company. So yeah, my role is really fun. I do the nitty-gritty media stuff for Press Gazette, looking at the issues we've been talking about, as well as tech relations with tech giants, which is interesting, and not just relations, I suppose, but also the regulation that's coming across the world. So that's all really interesting. I was formerly the North America editor of Press Gazette, which is kind of how I got into that area of things specifically. And then I also write regularly for the New Statesman. I'm their media correspondent, and so I guess I'd say the two roles kind of complement each other quite well, because the Press Gazette side of things keeps me very close to the ground in terms of what the latest trends are in the media, business of media, the nitty gritty, as it were. And then for the New Statesman, I'd take a subject that, like what's going on at the BBC, that's more interesting to an audience which is interested in politics, current affairs, and bringing that together. So that works really well for me. It's a good fun role, and I'm lucky to be able to work for two great publications.
And to give you some unsolicited praise as well, I think you've done a great job in particular of really making Press Gazette into more of a global brand. I mean, every time I go in Nyman Lab, there's always a Press Gazette story on there, or Media Gazer, the like. Is that reflected in the readership stats that you're seeing as well?
Yes, yeah. I think I don't have them off the top of my head. I'm sure they probably haven't been shared fully either. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think not just in terms of big, where are the clicks coming from, but also the caliber of reader, I think, has really grown in North America. I think so. When I was there, I think we built up a strong newsletter there, which goes out every Friday, Future of Media US, that has some really, big name people who subscribe and let us know that what's interested them. And yeah, it was and the way that we did that, I think, to begin with, was just by going out and pitching interviews with some of the biggest people in the US media, to make sure that they, to begin with, were the ones who were reading it. So Henry Blodgett at Insider, Jim Van Der Hey, at Axios, and I think we're really pleased with that. It's definitely got more global, and I think the good thing about that is probably that it's made readers in the UK, people who run media businesses in the UK, editors-in-chiefs, chief executives, I think it's made them more interested in getting into Press Gazette, because it means that they're not just being read by their peers in the UK, but they're also being, read by people in the US, Canada, Australia, across the world, really. So yeah, it's been good. And as I mentioned before we actually came on camera, but in Press Gazette, New Statesman's doing very well. Press Gazette's also doing very well. I think it's in, financially, it's in its best position for many, many years. So things are looking positive, I'd say.
Fantastic. On that note, Will, we're going to end it there.